So I want to welcome everyone, and I want to thank the rabbi for coming on. I've been actually, believe it or not, I remember Rabbi Winston from Toronto going to his shiurim all the way back then, who's been predicting and talking about everything that we're going through. And I reached out to him recently, and he was so kind to come on to this platform. Rabbi Winston is the author of the weekly parsha sheet, Perceptions, available through Torah.org, or his own site, 36.org, or Shaarnun Productions. He lives in Israel with his wife and family. He has also authored over 110 books on varying topics of Torah, hashkofah, several which focus on the end of days and the final redemption. They contain many important sources and insights regarding our period of history and why it is all part of the long-awaited final redemption. Most books are available through Amazon.com, and I did share all this, so you can go directly into them, and his sites as well. His most recent book is called Bridging the Gap, Using Kabbalah to Explain Current History. You can also see Rabbi Winston's many videos on different topics on YouTube, and he also gives a Zoom shiur Thursday nights at 7:30 p.m. Israel time. He can be reached by email at pinchasw@36.org. Thank you so much, Rabbi Winston. I really, really appreciate this. I think we need very badly to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. It's December 7th today, and I don't know how many people remember how important that day was, the day that President Roosevelt called a day in infamy, because it was the day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, sinking most of the Pacific fleet, leading to the Americans' involvement in World War II. They had been pacifists until that time. They actually were the 17th strongest military power at the time, and overnight after that became the leading military power, turning almost every state into some part of their military buildup. It was also the beginning of the end of the Holocaust. The Holocaust hadn't begun yet. It wouldn't begin for another year or two. But it's only because of the Americans' involvement, because Baruch arranged it, discussion to itself, but all the hashkofah that went into that particular attack that caused the Americans to go in. And because of that, Baruch Hashem, the good guys won the war, and eventually they liberated the camps, and the rest is all there in the history books. It happens to also be today the 17th of Kislev. And unbeknownst to many people, that day also is a day of infamy, but in a very positive way, because of all the hashkofah pratis that went on at that time. It was the 17th of Kislev in 1947 that the United Nations actually voted to allow Israel to become an official state, become one of the family of nations, they call it, right? And it wasn't officially noted or set up or announced to the world until the following year, of course, May 5th, 1948. But it was the 7th of Kislev that the actual vote took place, and that was when that changed. And some people might say, who cares? What difference does it make? What do we care? Especially when you look at the UN today, what do we care what the UN has to say about anything to do with the Jewish people? But the reality is that, and I also said that too for some time until I saw the Gra, until I saw the Vilna Gaon, what he has to say about the whole process of Geula. And he mentions that if there's two ways the Jewish people can actually go about bringing the redemption. One is called Achishena, one is called Be'ita. They both come from the pasuk from Yeshaya in chapter 60, verse 22. And there Yeshaya predicts, and he says that the Geula will come, Achishena Be'ita, will come, I will hasten it, and in its time, which sounds like just one redemption, but the Gemara learns out that these are actually two words that mean two different types of redemption. One is that it can come hastened early, and the second, it comes in the last possible time. That's what it says, and that's how the Gemara learns it. Not, the obvious pshat is that it's one time, but the Gemara says it's two times, and the difference, of course, is if it comes early, it's because the Jewish people merit it, And if they merit it, then it all happens nicely, the way we'd love it to happen, very peacefully, no wars. The world understands the Jewish people are God's people, and that the land belongs to us, and Mashiach comes. That's the nice, ideal right after the sunset version of Gula. But the other way, if it comes to be taught at the last possible moment, then that's basically to the war of Gog and Magog, and the one we're trying to avoid. According to the Chafetz Chaim, according to the Medrash, there's actually 3 wars of Gog and Magog, and according to the Chafetz Chaim, 2 of them have already happened: World War I, World War II. The Gemara seems to talk about Chizkiah in his time having a more or less war of Gog and Magog with Sancherib as well. But everyone seems to, talk about the third one as one that's still yet to happen, or at least become completed. But that's what Yeshaya says. That's what the Gemara learns out, Achshem Bita. And what's very, very fascinating is that it was pointed out to me this last year that if you take the gematria of both of those words, right, you take the gematria of, I just have to bring this up so I can get it right, 1 second, that if you take the gematria of both words, right, Achishena being 374, and gematria is you take the numerical value, you add up the letters, each letter corresponds to a value, you take the total, you add them up, you get a simple gematria. There's 7 forms of gematria, Kabbalistically, but these are the simplest version of gematria. And you get 374 plus 477, which is equal to 850, I believe. Oh, no, sorry, 851. 851. Now, why is that significant? Because this rabbi pointed out that if you take the date of the 17th, it was actually the 16th, pardon me, it was yesterday, the 16th of Kislev that had happened. We'll come back to 17th in a second, right? It was actually the 17th and the 16th. Why? Because we'll see that you take the gematria of Kislev, and Kislev has a yud. Normally, we don't necessarily write it with a yud, but that's the way it's spelled with a yud. You take the full gematria of Kislev, you take the 16th that it happened on in New York, and then you add the year. You don't use the 5,000, but you just use the 7,008 because that's, a millennium changes only once every 1,000 years. So we don't write that. We just write, Taf Shin, Pei Vav, whatever the year is. And you add it all together and you get 850. The 2 words together, they total 851, but the date that the Eretz Yisrael was actually officially accepted as a nation was the gematria is 850. So a person would say, okay, that's significant. It's close. It's very close. Why is it so important? I failed to mention the point. But the Gra says that if the Jewish people don't merit redemption the proper way, or at least a nicer way, then it has to come with the approval of the nations. It has to come, that's what he says, and it brings the pasuk from Shir Shirim, right, that to make his point, but there's a Kabbalistic tradition, and he says that that's what happened in Koresh's time, right? The Jewish people were exiled from the land after the destruction of the first base of Mikdash by Nebuchadnezzar and his army, and they were taken into slavery, and in the 52nd year, in 3390 from creation, so that's when Cyrus, or Koresh in Hebrew, and the Persians, they conquered Babylonia, took it over, they inherited the Jewish people in the exile, and he gave permission for the Jewish people miraculously. The Gemara even refers to him as having the spirit of Mashiach ben Yosef in him when he did this. He's a Gentile king, and certainly not a tzaddik, that's for sure not. But somehow Hashem put it into him, and that was the reason why he gave this incredible, unprecedented, permission to go back and begin construction on the second temple. And he says that's the way it has to happen. If the Jewish people don't merit redemption the proper way, then it does make a difference what the nations say. In fact, the Brisker Rav is quoted as saying the only reason why the UN came into existence was just for that one vote, because clearly after that they haven't done too much good. But that particular vote, that is consistent with the Gra Shita, that's what has to happen. So it's hugely significant, especially if you understand the hashkofah. And this is not even the part I want to talk about today, but just to mention because it's very important in terms of the whole idea. But the actual that should coincide, but we're still off by one value. The Rav who gave this over, he was satisfied with that. He was satisfied that we're off by one. You should know in gematria sometimes You can be off by one. It's not a problem. It's not the best, but you can be. It's close enough. And the odds of it working out that way, that the day that they should decide, they didn't know about this gematria, they didn't know about Achishan, they didn't know about the Gra, right? But the day they decide to do this, it should be actually coincide with the gematria that the words that actually talk about the final redemption is highly significant. As it happened to be, hashkofah, I was asked a question that week by somebody about something else, completely different to do with Eretz Yisrael. And it forced me to go back to a sefer called Tuva Aretz, which is a sefer on Eretz Yisrael that was really based upon the teachings of the Arizal to do with Eretz Yisrael. A very fascinating story behind it. But I had to look up something else for this person because it had been some time since I'd seen this sefer. So I looked it up. And in the process of looking it up, I came across something, just my eyes scanned it for one moment. I'd underlined it because it was important to me, and I'd forgotten about it. But when I looked for this one particular point for this person, so then I also saw this as well, but I filed it away in my head, future use. It didn't have that much importance at the moment, other than the fact that it was an important idea, but nothing to do with anything else I was working on at the time. And then, because of this gematria that this person shared with me from this Rav who lives up in, I think, up in the Haifa, and he didn't see the sefer. He was satisfied because that's as far as he could go. But I happened to see, because of this question, the person asked me the very week that this was told to me, that because Eretz Yisrael is the center of the Jewish people, the Yishuv is Eretz Yisrael, that anything that happens to Jews anywhere in the world goes after the time in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is the center of the Jewish people. So if it happens in Texas at a certain time, the time that counts is the corresponding time in Eretz Yisrael. 6-hour difference, 7-hour difference, 10-hour difference. That's the time that counts. So the first thing I did, and today you can do things like this so easily, so readily, that I Googled to see exactly what happened on when this thing took place, and in December that year. And sure enough, it took place at 5:30 in the afternoon. It was actually a late vote. They usually vote early in the day. For some reason, they voted at 5:30 that day. So I looked at the time difference at that time. 7 hours time difference. Was already the 17th of Kislev in Eretz Yisrael, which means that the gematria of the words Achishena Bita exactly equal the gematria of the date that the UN voted for Israel to be a state. If you calculate the odds of that happening, they're astronomical. Astronomical. Does it make a difference? Does it change anybody? I mean, I got very excited. As they say, I was blown away. I mean, there's not you learn a lot of things, and there's a lot of fantastic information. I've seen a lot of gematrias. I've been learning Kabbalah for some time, and I've seen remarkable things that, give me tremendous sense of joy. But things like this, where they work out so perfectly like that, and the theme and everything, amazing. I told several people, and of course, people, yeah, it's amazing. It's absolutely fantastic. No one can test it because it fits perfectly, but does it change anything? Has anybody picked up and made aliyah because of? No. Why would they? Why should they? Okay, so all you've shown is maybe possibly that 1948 or 1947, when this took place, was a cheluk of the redemption. You would only basically be able to show from it maybe a little bit to people who say, no, it wasn't part of the redemption, that, not like that at all, right? And certainly since the last 70 years, things have significantly changed to support the idea that was a chelek. Okay, but so it's a chelek. Big deal. Big deal. So I agree. There are people, I talk to people all the time. I teach people in Chutz La'aretz. I used to go traveling, and they're my meaning. They believe in Geula. They want the redemption, but they don't believe it's time to come home yet. They don't believe it's time to pack up, and to sell the house and to uproot families. It's a big deal. It's a very big deal. It's a lot involved. Obviously, the less you have to do to leave, the less connections you have to Chutz La'aretz, the easier it is. But for those who are stuck, and that's why Rashi says, he says in Parsha Nitzavim, I believe, where it's talking about kibbutz galus, Kodesh Baruch Hu promises that he's going to gather the Jews at the end of history, which is a phenomenal thing to say 3,000 years ago. when we don't even know what the history is going to look. We haven't gotten to the Eretz Yisrael yet. We haven't got the land yet, let alone be exiled once, twice, three times. And it's already talking about the end of days, how Hashem's in the four corners. What's the four corners of the earth? You're living in the midbar. What's the four corners of the earth? What does that even mean? God put it there. It's the Torah. Well, just wait to find out. And there it is. And the Gemara said that's in his time. This is the Dor Batra. He said the final generation. He focused from the age of 20 onward on Kibbutz Galus. We're living in Eretz Yisrael today. The original settlers who came back and rebuilt the Yishuv were his Talmidim, his students who put up with the worst conditions just to fulfill their Rebbe's words. The Gra was on his way and got turned around for specific reasons and wasn't able to make it, broke his heart, but his Talmidim, they were the ones who started and built up the Yishuv that we're now enjoying so much. There's streets in Harnaf and different places and Rechavia named after their Talmidim. And the people who came and worked, so hard to get things started. But the point being that, we could, the Gula process can take a long time. I'm going to come. A classic thing that people used to say, when Mashiach comes, I'll come, right? Until he comes, I'm here. It's just too much work. When he comes, so Rashi says, Kibbutz Galius is going to be so difficult at the end of days that Ki'ilu Kodesh Baruch Hu is going to have to take the Jews by the hand himself. The Chvod of the Atzma is going to come and have to take Jews by the hand. What does that even mean? So in my mind, that conjures up an image of a parent who tells their child, you can stay at this birthday party until 5 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, I come to pick you up and we go home, right? And the child says, yes, Hima, sure, right? And of course, 5 o'clock comes around and the kid's still having a good time, and the mother comes in and says, come on, we need to go. And he says, just 5 minutes more, 10 minutes more, he won't go. At some point in time, the mother might give him, a little bit of leeway, but at some point in time, the mother says, that's it. And she grabs him by the hand and she schleps him out because they got to go home, make supper, with the rest of the family. So Kish Baruch was like, this is an ongoing phenomenon by the Jewish people. We don't have to go very far to see the root of it. And people don't realize because the Torah doesn't talk about it. But the Torah says very specifically, that, Rashi brings down that not everybody survived. Right? We learn from the word chamushim in Parshas B'Shalach, but actually Rashi brought it back down in Parshas Bo, where the plague of darkness took place. And they asked the question, why was it 7 days long? Why did he need darkness for 7 days? And Rashi explains, because there were a lot of Jews who didn't want to go out. They didn't want to leave, right? They thought, well, Egypt was destroyed now. Their power was finished, right? And we had built the place, right? It was our buildings. We put all this blood, sweat, and tears to build Egypt. So why not stay behind and enjoy it? It wasn't part of the program. There wasn't an option. This is a gula, right? Either you go or you don't go anywhere except the Shemayim. So during Makas Choshech, 12 million Jews died by the hand of Hashem because they didn't want to go out. And you have to ask the question, why wouldn't? And that's twice the Holocaust, more or less, right? How is it possible? How is it possible that many people could die? And it was across families, across social strata. It doesn't make a difference. You had to want to go. That was the main thing at that time. And that 12 million should die, and the Torah should even talk about it, should just hint to it, leave it to the Medrash. Even more disturbing than that is a Gemara in Sanhedrin, right there in the Gemara, written by people living in Chutz La'aretz. Rava is living in Bavel. He's not living in Eretz Yisrael. He's living in Bavel at the height, right? But he's living in Bavel. And after the Gemara discusses this whole thing about how, so few people who left Mitzrayim actually made it to Eretz Canaan, he says, the Gemara says, V'amar Rava says, V'chein Yemos HaMashiach. And the first time I saw that, many years, I started to look around. Anybody argue with that? What does it mean? Statement is just made by the Gemara. Nobody argues on it. No one says anything other. Explains it otherwise. The Gemara is very clear. whatever happened here. But then it goes on to also explain, and the Arizal goes into a lot of detail about this, and it's a shir into itself. And some of the books I've written have already, brought all this down. But it says very specifically that the final redemption really actually is the completion of the first one. In other words, we didn't finish the job clearly leaving Mitzrayim, and therefore we took a break, right? We kind of like spread it out over the course of 3,300 some odd years. But the final redemption, including Moshe Rabbeinu, whose soul will come back in Mashiach ben David to finish the job he started, will lead us out. And it says in Micha, like the days of leaving Mitzrayim. And the Rizal brings down how the souls actually of the generation were actually the same souls that Mitzrayim, Moshe Rabbeinu. There's a lot of Torah behind all this idea. But we have been forever the last ones to somehow know what's going on, or at least to accept the changes in history that seem to somehow signal. There's always been individuals in history who have always seen it. There are people living in Eretz Israel today who left Germany between 1933 and 1939 as part of the Havara Agreement because they saw what was happening and they saw a window and they took it. The rest stayed behind. Well over 100,000 Jews stayed behind in Germany because they said, we're just as German as the next German and hopefully this won't get that bad. And they died. They all perished in the Holocaust. Spain, right? We lost everything. They actually, Beryl Wine brings down in his book, all of his history books are extremely informative. Some always have some kind of facts and details that nobody else seems to have. But he writes in his book that when they left Spain, and after the whole thing fell apart in Spain, the golden era came to an end. So then he says that there was a Pinchas where they had a discussion, like a little, some like community book, like a log, so to speak, where they actually discuss what was it that they did or didn't do that led to the fall of Spanish Jewry. Because it was a great time, financially, spiritually. It was a very perfect, ideal era. That's why it's called the Golden Era. And they lost all of it. They lost their possessions. They had to go into exile, those who survived. And it's been, never got, as good since then at that time. I mean, today, we have other issues. They didn't have assimilation like we have today, so as good as it is today, but we have other problems. Anyhow, but they wrote in their Pinchas that there was a time when they all got together, the Moses, Gedolei Torah, and the leaders, and they all got together and they discussed what they should do with all this capital they've built up and all the success they have. So they actually suggested the possibility of sending expeditions to Eretz Israel, maybe buying back pieces of lead and rebuilding the Yishuv. And then they decided against it. And they themselves said they felt that was the reason why they lost everything. They said it, not me, not some historian. They said it. So, this is the Jewish people. And it's ongoing. Ad kedei kach today, right? We have a situation, the world has changed. I remember thinking the 1990s, very happily before I knew most of what I know today, thinking to myself, I think we've beaten anti-Semitism. The leader of the ADL at that time was talking to some other Jewish leaders at some Jewish function of secular Jewish leaders, but they're talking about state of the Jewish people and Eretz Israel, and there were no anti-Eretz Israel people at that time, and someone said to him, he said, "Why is the ADL still in existence? Anti-Semitism is dead." For the most part. He said they always find some kind of graffiti on the walls of some bathroom but against the Jews. He said, that's what he said, He said, but in general, Baruch Hashem, the world's more civilized. All he had to do go back to 1930, 39, 1940, the most civilized nation on the face of the earth at that time was Germany. And they thought the same thing. The world became too civilized. So you know what they did? They did all the terrible things in a more civilized way. They used technology. They were more orderly about it. The Cossacks just came and butchered people. So they didn't do it like that. Instead, they shot them in front of open pits. No, they did it in a more civilized way, if you want to say like that. But they did it anyhow. The Torah is very explicit about how the world can change, but not man. Man is man. And that's what it means in last week's parsha, right? When Esau comes up and meets with Yaakov, and they have this historic confrontation that ends up being just a discussion in the end, but actually much more powerful than that. Because we're told by Rashi that Esau actually came to kill Yaakov. He tried to bite him in the neck and kill him like an animal. But Yaakov's neck, whatever this means, like Moshe's neck back in Paro or later on, right, miraculously turned to marble, very hard, and so Esau's teeth broke. And so rather than kill Yaakov, he probably asked him for the name of a good dentist because he no longer had his teeth, and so he couldn't fight him. So therefore, they got along nicely and they separated. They went different directions in the end. Just as a side point, it's actually interesting because you look at the wording of Rashi, which is really the Sifrei in Parsha Bolosacha. It says, we learn from this, halachahi, which is also interesting language. It literally means the law. Halachahi. Not just like, it's like a minhag or it's this is the way of nature of Esav. It's halachahi. This is the way the world is made. Esav sona leYaakov. Esav hated Yaakov. That's what we learn. Esav automatically, whether he likes to or not, hates Yaakov. What's the nafkamin, as they say? What does this really teach us in the end? This little medrash is telling you a very important point, that when the nations of the world, like Lavan and his sons at the time, are being nice to the Jewish people, that's supernatural. That's not nature. That's not the natural way. The natural way is they do what they've been doing for thousands of years. If they're being nice to us, it's because Hashem is making them nice to us. For whatever reason, he's making nice to us. And then when Hashem decides that it's time to go home, it's over, he begins to take away his protection. And that's why Yaakov immediately wakes up and what signals to Yaakov it's time to go home? Because it says his brothers-in-law, who were only born, as Lavan says, because Yaakov joined their camp. He was the source of brucha for their lives. Lavan admits that. So the brothers-in-law had to know that as well. Do a blood libel. They say that Yaakov got rich off our father. He's taking our father's money, even though they're all agreement. And Lavan switched it 1,000 times. But Yaakov is the most honest person in the world. Midas emes. And they're already accusing Yaakov of stealing from their father, jealousy, and things like that. But the clincher was the next day. It says, Yaakov saw the face of Lavan, and it wasn't the same as it was yesterday. Maybe he lost money in the stock market. Maybe he had something bad for breakfast. I mean, not everyone smiles nicely all the time. Even the nicest people have their days, have their moments. What does that mean? So Yaakov understands that Lavan was different. There was something that was different. He was not the same person he was for 20 years. Time to go, time to leave. And he did. He packed up. Akash Baruch Hu confirmed it. Rachel and Leah agreed to it, and they packed up, and he went so quickly that even Lavan didn't have a chance to say goodbye, to chase after him and finally catch him by Har Gilad, and then the whole story right before Parshas Yishlach. Right, and this is the message for all the Jewish people all Israel, but we don't learn it. We don't learn it. In fact, the Malbim says, right, and this is really consistent with, if you look at the language of the language of the Sifra that Rashi brings down, it says Esav sona leYaakov. It doesn't say Esav sona es Yaakov. If you wanted to say someone hates somebody, say es Yaakov. I mean, Lu Yaakov, to Yaakov. Esav hates to Yaakov. It's not normal to say that. But the word sona also can mean enemy, and it would mean a different pshat. It would mean that not only does Esav hate Yaakov, but Esav is an enemy. Sona is an enemy to Yaakov. That changes. You see, if Esav hates Yaakov, it has nothing to do with Yaakov. Esav hates. There are people who hate people for their own reasons, and it doesn't make a difference what you've done. They might just hate you anyhow, because that's the way they are. Jealousy, whatever the case may be, like this week's parsha with Yosef and his brothers. But Esav, Soina li Yaakov, puts it on Yaakov now. From Yaakov's perspective, Esav was an enemy. Why? I mean, he was clearly. That means no question on that. But what's the chiddush then? We know this before. So the Medrash says that Esav actually tried to go into business with Yaakov. He said to Yaakov, "Listen, I'm not good at this spiritual stuff. I faked it a bit back home, but you clearly are the one. You know how you talk to God. You know what He wants and all that, right? And I believe this. I think all the world to come, but I'm not going to go there based upon my lifestyle. So how about I support you in Kollel, and you take me to the world to come with you?" It's a Yisachar Zvulun relationship. We have contracts today for things like you can actually do this today and contract with the person you're supporting in Kollel, and you get a share in their Olam Haba. It's famous. Goes back to the Shvatim. So what was Yaakov's problem? Why did he say no in the end? He said, no, it's okay. I think I'll support myself, and Hashem will take care of me. I think you go your own way. Why turn it down? Because Yaakov understood. He's Zvulun and Yisachar. They're both tzaddikim. They're both Jews. They're both part of the Shvatim. There's nothing wrong there. On the contrary, you're not going to be pulled down by either one. Even though Zvulun is out there working in the season and all that, but they learn Torah. They love Torah too. So they're not going to pull down Yisachar. And Yisachar is certainly not going to pull down Zvulun. But Esav and Yaakov says, no way. Just trying to work with you is going to pull me down. Rav Dessler says that the reason why, we start off the Shemoneh Esrei by saying Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, and Elokei Yaakov. But we only finish off with Magen Avraham. We don't say Magen Avraham, Magen Yitzchak, and Magen Yaakov. Why? Why not? Why are we inconsistent over here? So he explains, because Avraham was the only one doing Kiruv. And because he was out in the streets, even though he was a tzaddik and he was the Shem Shemaim and he was not tempted by anybody, he was mushpa. You can't help it. You're around the wrong elements. You're around the Gentile world. You're going to be affected by Yam Suf. When the Midas Adin wanted to drown the Jewish people because they too did Avodah Zorah, because Baruch Hu said, no, there's a difference. The Mitzrayim, they did Avodah Zorah out of B'toch Ratzon. They chose to do it. They didn't have to, but they wanted to. But the Jewish people, B'toch Shibud. They only got involved in Avodah Zorah because they were living amongst Egyptians for so long. It's kind of hard to keep it out the entire time. So Yaakov understood this, so that's how he made Esav an enemy. He said, because if I do that, at least I will be protected from the influence of Esav, and I won't be pulled down by him. I won't be, concretized in his place, so to speak, which fits perfectly with the Malbim. The Malbim, who lived in the 1800s, right, long before we got back a Jewish state, long before the Shibud was over, he wrote, based upon a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, Lamed Aleph, pasuk Tezvah, Tezayin, and he says, based upon the pasuk, I'll just tell you the parish that he says. The pasuk itself mentions a few things about Gula, and he explains, the pasuk mentions Yaakov and then Yisrael. Now, if you read the pasuk, it just sounds like Hashem is using both names, because the Gemara says you can use still both names of Yaakov, not Avram, but Yaakov and Yisrael you can use kind of interchangeably even today. So the pasuk is doing that for whatever reason. He says no, the pasuk is teaching you something. The pasuk is being makpid about something. What's that? So he says the pasuk is telling you that the end of days. He says when the shibud finally ends. Right? When the Shibud comes to a conclusion, in his time, that was still a long time away. Didn't really happen until 1989, right? When the Russian, the Iron Wall came down, and the Berlin Wall came down, and Jews, until that time, Jews were stuck in Russia. It was the last place a mass of Jews against their will were stuck in a place in the Shibud. When that happened, that was after thousands of years of Shibud, that ended. That's a huge thing. We again take for granted, another historical thing, right? But it was major, and the Malbim says when that happens, all of a sudden the Jews are going to find themselves in a whole different position, as opposed to being spit on and stepped on and killed and murdered and hated and all that. All of a sudden they're going to find themselves at the heads of nations, the peak of nations. They're going to get jobs among the Gentiles. They're going to run the banks, as the banks, but you see today, politics. They're going to all of a sudden be accepted by the nations of the world, or at least the Western nations of the world, and find themselves in tremendous positions of influence. And they're going to say, and he says they're called Yaakov. When the pasuk talks about Yaakov, it's talking about them. He says the masses, the majority of the Jews will be like this. He's predicting this. He's based on the pasuk. Probably is a Masorah, but it's long before today, right? And he says that they're going to say, this is Geula enough. This is enough. We've arrived. The fact that we're able to do this and be like this and live side by side and have the same type of houses and cars and clothing and not have to walk down the street worry if there's going to be knife somewhere, except in bad neighborhoods. This is amazing. And he says, but there'll be a smaller element called Yisroel. And that element is going to say, this is nice. No question, this is nice. But until we go back and we build the base of Mikdash, and the Shekhinah comes back into it, it's not called Gula. And they work on that. And the Malbim says, in their merit, and he's living in Chutz La'aretz too, by the way, in their merits, the Gula will come. And that's what Yaakov was worried about. He knew that if we're going to live amongst the Gentiles, if we're going to work amongst them and be accepted, as they say, based upon this all through history, nothing better for the Jew than anti-Semitism. Well, not from our perspective. We surely don't want that. But it means, to keep us connected, to stop the assimilation, to stop the intermarriage, all these things that water down the Jewish people and keep us locked into places that we really don't belong and can't leave when we should. I'm going to read you something, right, that you all know, because it's from Sefer Yonah. Sefer Yonah is a really interesting sefer, not very long. And for those who are not aware, it's the maftir on Yom Kippur afternoon. And it's considered to be a schooler for Parnasa. So much so that I think you can go online and see on eBay how every year people actually auction it off for like $27,000, just in the Aliyah, right? Here, the most in my shul goes for like 4,000 shekels. And actually, it's one person who buys it every single year, and he's the only one who can afford it, and he bids against himself most of the time, right? Most people stop at 1,000, 2,000 maybe, right? But it's such a powerful aliyah, and all it is a haftarah. And what's the haftarah? It's a little unusual. It's why Yom Kippur of all times? This is when we read the Sefer Yonah, right? A person who is given a mission by Hashem, and then he doesn't want to do it because of he's afraid of the consequences for his own people, so he runs away to Tarshish. In the meantime, he's on a ship, and the ship is is up and down in the terrible storm, and finally they throw him over the boat because he says that's the only way to calm the waters down. And lo and behold, a big fish comes along, not a whale, but a big fish comes along and swallows him up, right? And somehow he's able to survive inside this fish, and he goes to the shore, and then Hashem talks to him once again, and he realizes you can't run from God. You can't run from your responsibility. You can't run from God. And he goes to Nineveh, and they do tshuva, because they say that the leader, the head of Nineveh was actually Paro, who had run from Egypt and somehow lived a long life, and he was in Nineveh, and he said that when God says he's going to do something, you should take him seriously. So they all put on sak v'afer and the whole thing, and the tshuva, and then they end the story with the kikaron. You know the story, right? That's in brief. Why read it on Yom Kippur? So there's different explanations. Some, first of all, say it was just a mashal about really the soul coming from Shemayim and going into the body and not wanting to be there, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's why it's on Yom Kippur, because we're dealing with souls and bodies and angels and all these things like that. But different explanations. But the truth is, there's really one thing that really tells you straight out what the whole basis of this maftir, this story is embedded on the holiest day of the year. And this is what it says, right? The storm has come, and the ship is going up and down and back and forth, and they're all like worrying and praying to whatever Avodah Zarah they know. And it says the sailors were frightened, and each one cried out to his God, and they cast the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten for them. So it's like they just lost their parnasa. That's how bad the situation is. And Yonah went down to the ship's hold, laid down, and fell asleep. He fell asleep. I mean, I have difficulty sleeping when my neighbors upstairs make too much noise running across the floor, when their grandchildren are skipping rope, just above my head. It's noisy, right? If I hear motorcycles, which I do, without their mufflers gun, it's bothersome. I'm not going to fall asleep with things like that, for sure. And I can tell you for sure that on a ship is going up and down and back and forth, I'm not going to sleep. On the contrary, I'm going to be panicking like everybody else. Oh, hi, guys. It's like, yeah, terrible weather we're having. If you need me, I'll be downstairs in the hold having a nap. Were you crazy? Right? So it says the captain approached him and asked, "Why do you sleep?" So he obviously fell asleep. He was able to sleep. Amazing, right? I wish I had such sleep habits. Get up and call out to your God. Perhaps God will think about us and we will not perish. And so he does. Well, he does actually do that. He explains who he is, where he came from, why this storm is happening, more than likely, and how you have to throw me overboard if you want to survive. And they're a little bit, tzaddikim over here. They refuse to kill someone to save their own lives until they insist upon it. And of course, everything works out the way it's supposed to. They go to shore and they actually offer karbanos to Kodesh Baruch Hu because of what happened over here. But the story is like, there's the center of the story right here. And you learn right here why we read this in Yom Kippur and why this is so important to everything to do with the Jewish people, and especially Gula, right? Why? Because this is telling you how, even though the rest of the world is in the middle of a storm, right? And they're all panicking what to do and how to deal with the problems, the Jewish people can be the last to admit it. The Jewish people can be asleep at the wheel. Or Ikra Mashiach, right? The heel of Mashiach, sleep at the heel. Meaning that here we are at a time of Ikra Mashiach, and what are we doing? How are we dealing? So some people, they're real, and they deal with it, and they're looking forward to it. There's a mitzvah called Tzipis to Yeshua. The Gemara says there are 6 things you ask a person on the day they die, the day of judgment, right? And one of them is Tzipis to Yeshua. Did you anticipate redemption? What does it mean to anticipate redemption? Well, I can tell you one thing for sure. When I anticipate anything, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to my whole world revolves around that particular thing, more or less. It's not like, yeah, there's an idea called redemption. One day it's going to come, it will come. In the meantime, let's get back to the meal. Everything has to be like that in mind. There's another medrash. This is in the Gemara. I'm mostly, sticking to the sources over here. Just as a side, when I was contacted by Mrs. Greenberg to do this about 2 weeks ago, I began to think about it, what I'm going to say. So I made some notes, at first, and the notes became paragraphs, and the paragraphs became pages, the pages became chapters, and now it's a book, right? And a lot of this information, I'm leaving out a lot of information. You'll find it in that. Hopefully, within a week or two, it'll be finished with Hashem. But you should just know, whatever I'm saying here, there's a lot more information that I'm not saying that backs up all of this. So if you want to know the full picture, you should read it. You should see it for yourself. The Medrash says in the Gemara in Baba Basra, it says, Rabbi Bar Chana said, famous Medrash, right? Once I was traveling on a boat and saw a large fish, another fish, right? Another large fish, right? Upon whose back grass was growing. I'm not quite sure which fish can have grass grow on their backs, but that's what the story says. We thought it was an island. We descended, we baked and cooked upon it. When the back of the fish became hot, it turned over, and had the ship not been so near to enable us to jump into it, we would have drowned. That's the story. Now, anybody who knows Agadata, Midrashim from the Gemara, knows that the stories don't have to be true. I mean, clearly, they don't have to be exactly the way they're being described here. Chazal had to write down Torah Shebaal Peh, and they didn't want to spill everything into the public because it's meant to be for the Jewish people only, and there's secrets, big secrets embedded in Torah Shebaal Peh. Kabbalah is part of that as well. So what they did, in order to be able to allow it to survive, but not yet actually, not be so revealed, they would build points into stories. And those stories became the means to transmit that information, but you had to have keys. So someone wrote a book called The Juggler and the King, based upon the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon, provides a lot of information about some of the Midrashim, but this one comes from Rabbeinu Yaakov from the 1800s, who wrote a sefer on the Gadata of the Gemara, and he writes the following thing. Actually, this actually is coming from a sefer called Duvachi Yabi, who's quoting it, but he says the following: Rabbi Bar Chana saw with Ruach HaKodesh, right? Rabbi Bar Chana is a Tana. He's living the time of the Gemara. Okay, actually he's a Mora. Living the time of the Gemara, which is, we're talking about 500 CE at that time, more or less. So he saw with Ruach HaKodesh, the future, how the Jewish people would rule over a people in the end of days. The Jewish people assume that these people have no hope of ever overcoming them and will not subjugate them. When these people have suffered a lot, they will turn the plate over on its mouth. That's the lashon of the Gemara, and resist the Jewish people. If Mashiach is not close at hand, then the Jewish people will drown from the many problems that will arise. Let's take a moment of appreciation over here. The Eretz Yisrael is not in the hands of the Jewish people at this point in time when he's writing this. The Romans and the Holy Roman Empire after that, and eventually we lost the second Commonwealth. It's no longer in our possession. Jews are still living in Eretz Yisrael, but we don't have control over the land. The idea of getting the land back and being our land is an amazing prediction to make for well down the road. But that's a pasuk. Those are predictions in the Chumash. So all you're doing is echoing the Chumash in a sense, right? But the idea that we're going to rule over a people in the land, that is already going out on a limb. That's already putting yourself out there and taking a risk that you could be easily wrong. And when what? And then he says that the people will think that we can do whatever we want to them, and they will never turn back against us. And I remember when I saw this medrash, I'll tell you, immediately, I remember it being when I was a bocher yeshiva in the old city, and I was in the Mekolit once, and I was watching the way the owners of the Mekolit were talking to the Arabs at that time, and literally treating them like donkeys. And that was the prevalent opinion. The Israelis, that's the way they dealt with the Arabs at that time. Not some Americans and North Americans. We might not get along with the Arabs, like the Arabs, but you don't talk to them like that this very day. But they would. And I remember thinking to myself, this can't be good. You can't talk to people like that, even if you're enemies, and expect that nothing is going to happen in return. And then I watched the transformation living next to us all the time, going from being totally humbled and seemingly subservient to the Jews they were working for to becoming more chutzpahdik all the time. Until finally Intifada broke out in 1987. And I remember at that time I was already married, living in Harnaf. I was in Mekolit, Avi's Mekolit, that's what it was called at the time. I was in the Mekolit shopping with my wife, and it was 1987. And the Intifada had broken out, and there was incidences of workers rebelling against their owners. And Avi turned to these two Arab workers, and I'm overhearing this, and he says to them, he says, "You guys would never do that to me, right?" And they said, "You'd be the first." So I thought, let me take a look at their faces. Maybe they're smiling. No smile. They meant it. They meant it completely. And the rest is our history. The rest we've been watching for the last 20, 30 some odd years. And what's even worse, in the beginning, was just them and news, false news and things like that about attacks that never took place and building them up. But you should know they hired marketing firms at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, specifically because when they realized they couldn't win the battle physically, they chose instead to win the battles, socially, in world opinion. And they actually came to the Israeli government at the time and said, this was going on, we should really counteract. They said, no, it's not going to amount to too much. And here we have the world today, turning its back on us once again, forgetting the Holocaust, forgetting the Nazis, forgetting all of that, not looking at what's going on in the world, not confirming facts. They ask these people, do you even know what's going on? They question, they don't know. It doesn't make a difference. Somehow they just pile on against the Jewish people. And this is exactly what he's talking about. He predicted it back then. We're drowning from the problems that they're creating for us. The whole thing was a mashal. The fish turning over, right? That's the nation that we power over, turning over. And in fact, the Rosh Hashiva, just you should know, of Panovich at the time, when he was told this, shown this medrash, he said, that's our day today. That was in the 1970s already. This is before the Intifada, because this is our time now. He was talking about the end of days. So is it a sign? 100%. But, is it enough of a sign? At what point do I say to myself, what's going on in the world today is not just simple anti-Semitism. Who's behind all this? Well, we have stories. Everything that we're going through right now, there's a mashal, there's a story, there's an example, there's a medrash, there's something to tell us, to prepare us and help us. Signs to help us make those choices that we need to make to save ourselves. But how do you know? You don't. You don't. It's in your heart. Yet it comes down to who you are, what you believe, what you're prepared to give up, how much you believe in redemption. More than anything else, you should know, more than anything else, is how much you were prepared. You were prepared by your teachers, by your spouse, by your whatever had influence, your parents. One of the best examples is Chevli Mashiach. Why is it called Chevli Mashiach? Because the whole thing's compared to a birth process. And by the way, you run with the Gra, the Ramchal, where they talk about the end of days. There's a sefer called Achris Kereshis. You read that sefer, most of your doubts disappear. We are there. It's that time. In fact, the mashal I use to try to explain, where we're holding right now historically, it's like a guy who's in a taxi. He takes a taxi from point A to point B. And, takes a certain amount of time to get there. He's on his phone talking to somebody, making a business deal, whatever the case may be. The taxi gets to point A, point B. And point B, the taxi turns around, that'll be, 65 shekels, whatever. And he says, just give me 2 minutes, give me a few minutes more, and he's talking. The meter's running. It's fine. I don't mind. I'll pay whatever it is. I'm sitting here right now. I don't want to get out. Right? The taxi driver is anxious because he wants to get another fare. He wants to move. He wants to sit there the entire, even though he's getting paid, he doesn't want to sit there the entire time. So at some point in time, if the guy doesn't get out, the taxi driver says, will you please leave my car? Just pay and go out already. So I can move on. That's the Jewish people. What else do we need? Another mashal, right? It's like a son, a father and a son. A father says to the son, I bought you an apartment, right? It's not finished yet, but let me show it to you. So he takes him and he shows him the apartment, and the walls are up, the ceiling's all there, structure's there, it's all concrete, but there's no finishes yet, nothing, no furniture, nothing like that. He says, but another 6 months from now, this will be done, it'll all be finished, you'll see, you'll love it. So since I don't know, I kind of like where I am right now, I'm comfortable, it's what I'm used to, right? He says, I'm telling you, when you see this new place, you're going to want to live here. He says, well, we'll see, okay? So the father goes back and he spends all the money and he furnishes it, he fixes it up and completes it, furnishes, the whole thing. And he brings the son back and he says, well, what do you think? Look at what I've done with the place. And he says, yeah, great job, Dad, beautiful. But I still want to stay where I am. But I fixed it up for you, that you would be comfortable here. Yeah, I understand. It's a change. 100%. I get that. But nonetheless, so, 1948, we get the land back, where Dessler says anybody who doesn't see the hand of God in that is going to have to answer for later on. But we got the land back, and there were swamps. They talk about swamps. I'm not exactly sure where the swamps were, but they swamps that had to be drained, and the disease and all that. And people went in there, and they, and we did infrastructure, and they went to Germany and different places and brought materials and all that. Yeah, when I first came here in 1988. Actually 1982, it was kind of third worldish. The army not. In fact, I remember once taking I had a lift with, I was on a bus, sat next to a soldier going up north to Sfat, and he explained to me that we're talking about this, and I said, it's like the country's so backward. You're still in Makolik, you had to write down your, what you bought, and they kept track of it manually. So I said, the country, the army is so advanced. Why is it that this, society is not? So he said, because all the technology goes into the army, and it doesn't filter down to the rest of society. And that was 100% true. But then it changed. Baruch Hashem, they woke up and they realized, and today the place is incredibly advanced, probably the most advanced in terms of the rest of the world to a large degree. But in the meantime, the point was that the place got fixed up really nicely and furnished beautifully with tunnels and all kinds of technology, and really a tremendous place. And Kush Baruch Hu says to the Jewish people, "So, what do you think of the place? What I've done with the place. What do you think of it? It's beautiful, nice job. Come visit it. We'll stop by from time to time, but we like where we are. We like where we're living. We don't want to change places." Well, if you learn anything from the 4/5 that died in Mitzrayim, when it comes to Geula, there are no options. There are no options. I'm going to leave you with one more medrash for today, and just hope that you will follow up and go deeper into the topic and understand what's going on today affects all of us and is definitely part of the final redemption, but you have to decide for yourself what that means to you and how much you believe it. So this is a medrash from the Sefer Tuva Arts that I mentioned earlier, and from the Arizal. So it's not like just out there, some fringe medrash. But Nelson Shapiro, who was the Gadol Hador he was a Mordeh Asra in Poland, Krakow, Poland, before he made Aliyah. Immediately became the Mordeh Asra in Yerushalayim. He went fundraising for the Yishuv in Europe, got sick while he was there. Happened to be at that time, they just discovered in the 1600s the manuscripts of the Arizal. He was invited, or he joined them, and he got the Midrashim from the Arizal on Eretz Yisrael, and he put together a sefer called Tuva Arts, and the sefer has been around for hundreds of years. Beautiful sefer. Kabbalistic, but beautiful. And in there, he has one chapter called Praise of Those Who Dwell in Israel at the Time of Mashiach, meaning before Mashiach comes. Upon witnessing this, he's talking about after how the Mashiach's come, the war is over, the place is getting cleaned up, evil's gone from the world. Now we're all moving into this messianic era that we've been waiting for so long. It says, upon witnessing this, diaspora Jews will become upset and complain to Mashiach. What do they see? They see Jews flying around like angels in Eretz Yisrael. They look up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. No, it's a Jew, right? It's a Jew who was living there in Eretz Yisrael before Mashiach came, who made that move. So they're saying, right? They say, why did they merit to fly and live in an elevated spiritual state and not us, right? Are we not Jews like them? Mashiach will answer them. It is known that God works measure for measure, right? Midah keneged midah. They lived in the diaspora, but made efforts and sacrifices to elevate themselves by moving to the Holy Land and merited purity of soul, unconcerned about finances and health. Since they place spirituality over materialism, they merit, measure for measure, to be elevated to this lofty plane. You also had opportunities to go to Israel, but remained hesitant and reluctant, concerned more about your materialistic status, physicality being a higher priority than spiritual growth. Therefore, measure for measure, you remain physical. So there's a difference. There's a difference between making Aliyah before Mashiach comes and coming after. And a person might say at that point, okay, fine, I'm willing to accept that. So I'll wait a little longer to fly like an angel. But this way I get to have my cake and eat it too. I can stay in Chutz La'aretz as long as I have to. Then Mashiach will come, and I'll come in flying carpets and come here, and then eventually I'll watch them fly around, and I'll enjoy the sight and wait for the time to come. No, it doesn't work like that. That's what we say now. It's like the Ramchal says, a person could say that, Olam Haba, I don't mind being a lower level. If I can have a bit more of Olam Hazeh and be I'm okay with that. That's fine. But my neighbor will be in a higher level. Big deal. So I'll look up and I'll wait for him from a lower level. Because that's what you say now with the Sahara. That's what you say right now when you're bound. How many times do we make statements and we make assessments based upon a bias that we're living with? The moment the bias disappears, all of a sudden, clear vision. We see, that was the wrong decision to make. And he says, you get the world to come and you become the real you, unfettered by your physical body. You're not going to say that. You're going to say, what was I thinking? What was I thinking? In the 1930s, Zionists, secular Zionists, nonetheless, right? But Harbe Shlich Makom, and if you know Kabbalah, you know that Hashem works in the most mysterious of ways sometimes, because that's what happens when we don't listen to his messages. So he has to work, back channels. And they would go from shul to shul in Europe saying, Hitler's coming for you. This is in Beer Wine's book. He talks about this, right? Hitler's coming for you. You should go now while you can. More often than not, they literally picked up the person and they threw them out of their shul. That was that. And you have to wonder, how many of those Jews, while on the trains, they were real. Can't relate to it in our time, but they were real back then. On those trains, on those cattle trains being shipped off to work camps and labor camps and death camps, had wondered to themselves, if only we had taken those messages seriously, if only we had seen at the hand of Hashem in what was going on, only paid attention to the signs, and because we did have confirmation, we just didn't want to believe it. I was once talking in downtown New York about this very topic about 30 years ago, at least. And someone there got up and asked me, kind of like a little angry tone, and said, it will never happen in America. So I said to him, okay, but what's your proof? So he stopped for a second. He said, I'm just telling you, it will never happen in America. I said, I heard that part. Just tell me, what's your proof? Like what? You have a source? You have a pasuk? You have some gadol from 200 years ago, 300 years? Like what? Like we need sources for things like that. You're making millions of people put their lives in danger based upon what? You want to. I have sources to say not like that. We have a Chumash and Nevi'im who say not like that. So if you want to counteract that, you have a source for your side too. And he stood there and he realized he had no sources. So I asked him point blank, are you making your statement based upon fact or hope? And he thought for a second and he said, because the answer is obvious. He knew that that's what that was all about. He was really saying, I really hope it won't happen in America. But he knew that was nothing to stand on. That was just his wish, or Canada, or England, whatever. It doesn't make a difference. So I just leave with one more source. Sorry, just because I think it's apropos based upon what we're saying right now. Because again, it's all in the Torah. The Torah itself. You have to know the Torah. The Torah is like right there. If we don't believe, it's because we're not learning properly. We're not seeing all the sources. One of the most important psukim in the entire Chumash when it comes to things like this is one simple pasuk in Parsha Shmos that tells you everything about history. V'yakam melech hadash, a new king arose. Why? So the Medrash tells us, Rashi brings it down, because the old Paro still felt indebted to the Jewish people for Yosef's help. And when the nobles came to Paro and said to him, we don't trust these people. They make us nervous. They make us jealous. You gotta enslave them. Paro said, you can't. There's Yosef and his family. They did so much for us. How can you do that? This is Paro speaking. So the noble said, it's up to you. Either you keep your job and do what we say, or find another job. So actually, according to the Medrash, the Paro stepped down until he realized that he get none of the benefits, no pension, no dental, none of that stuff, without being Paro. So therefore, he came back, and Yacham Melech Hadash means it was the same Paro with a different attitude. And the moment that changed, everything changed. So Torah is telling you, it just takes one leader, just one leader. You combine all the sources together, Esav, Sunnis, Yaakov. We've been living in a wonderful period of exile. Honestly, it's been great. We had a wonderful time. It was so successful financially, even spiritually. It's been great, but that's not Jewish history. Not the way it's been up until now, until at least recent time. It's a whole different world. And it's all there, sitting there, festering, right? All it takes is just one leader to rise up and galvanize it. And overnight, everything changes, just like that. That's not my opinion. Those aren't my words. That's the Medrash, that's the Gemara, that's the Rishonim, that's the Acharonim, the Acharei Acharonim, you name it. Certainly in Kabbalah you find things like this. Yeah, people, I get kidded in my own family, right? As if like the happiest day of my life would be when the war of Gog and Magog starts. I can finally say, see, it happened. No. The war of Gog and Magog ruins my life too. I'm also going to be, I don't even know if I'm going to survive it myself. Even living next to Israel, who knows? You don't know the cheshbonos of Kosh Baruch Hu. We're just trying to do the smart thing over here. As a Jew, 3,300 so many years old, after going through so much of this so many times, And the Torah says, learn history, remember it. At some point in time, someone's got to say something and say, well, what about this? Is it time? Especially since the Gemara predicts that not everyone's going to sin anyhow. So I don't know who will survive. We don't know. But that's up to you to decide how you relate to it. So I just will leave you with one thought because it's important to know, because obviously you're not going to go home. I don't want any angry letters from your husbands. What did you make? Thanks. It's okay. I got enough on my plate to deal with it at this point in time. But if you're not in the process of making Aliyah, as we all should be, if you're not in the process of trying to be in the process of making Aliyah, which is already one level down, okay, then at least know one thing. David Melech said, Ata takum terchem tzion kiva moed. Right? Kosh Baruch Hu, get up and show mercy to Tzion. Tzion is the name of the Jewish people in Gula. It's the name of the Jewish people when we're being who we're supposed to be. It's the name that Nevi'im used to describe the Jewish people in their completed state. Show mercy on Tzion, Hashem, David says. Why? Well, I would have finished off because they're learning Torah, because they're doing kiruv, because they're doing mitzvahs galore. That's what I was taught. That's what I would have thought. And that is huge. No question about it. It contributes, but that's not what he said. Ki ratzu avdechas of neha vesafra yechenenu. Because your servants, they want her stones and they cherish her dust. That one pasuk. Put it up on your wall. Put it inside your sitter. Every day focus on it. That's the saving grace of the Jewish people at the end of days. It's not a coincidence that the most important issue affecting the Jewish people today in the whole world is tiny little Eretz Yisrael. Don't forget, it was the Meraglim who started this exile by rejecting the land. Because you have to understand where Eretz Yisrael represents the Jewish people. And then you understand why it's so important. It's not just a piece of land, not just geographical location. But that's what he said. How you feel about the land and the Kodesh Baruch Hu in the land and being there yourself, that can save you even when you're still living in the diaspora. It's part of being on track to the final redemption. We should all be blessed, B'ezras Hashem, to reach such levels, and that we should be saved no matter what the situation is. None of us have to perish. And I'm always holding out for one miracle that God has kept hidden from us the entire time. The Gemara kind of alludes to it a little bit, where it says that we suffered enough already. Maybe because Baruch Hu has up his sleeve, Kivayochel, one huge big miracle that saves all of us, no matter where we're holding, and just the realization of who he is enough tshuva for all of us to survive whatever's going to happen, to get rid of all the evil of the world once and for all. Serve us.
Wow. Wow. Before I open it up, wow, Rabbi Winston, it was unbelievable. Wow. I wanna ask a few questions before I open it up. Just quickly, it's late, but I wanted to ask you. We had Rabbi Tovia Singer on a few weeks ago, and he quoted certain things. He said one of the greatest problems that has happened is that the yeshiva world and the frum world stopped learning Navi. He said you don't even have to go into all these esoteric ideas. You just look at Nabi and you see exactly the situation we're in, exactly what everything is meant to be, everything. Right. He said something very interesting. He said, I don't know what he quoted, but he said that the fact that Yiddim are not coming to Eretz Yisrael, the fact that we don't have Eretz Yiddim coming, that in itself is holding back. That in itself can hold back Mashiach. And I don't know what he quoted, and I wanted to ask you that. That was one thing. The second thing I wanted to ask you is you mentioned that when the walls came down, that was one of the beginnings, right, of, I guess, I don't know if that was the beginning, that was a sign of redemption. But what about Jews in Iran? Why do we still have that concept? And another thing that I wanted to ask you is I spoke to somebody. I heard recently that Rav Ovadia Yosef's son, did you hear that? He said that redemption can't come for another 11 years. And I asked somebody who's in that Makubal world, very big, I asked what they're saying. She said, many are saying we're right there. We're there now. We are there now. She says, but there are some that say 11, 12, 13 years. I want to understand what you would think of that. And I also want to tell you one last thing. I'm sorry. One last thing I want to bring up. I listen to these unbelievable, I get up very early in the morning, so I listen to these podcasts, and I couldn't move this morning when I was listening to Yishai Fleischer. I'm sure you're familiar with who he is. He interviewed this security guy, and then I listened to Moshe Feiglin. And Moshe Feiglin said something so interesting, that this area that the government went in a few weeks ago and they destroyed 4 homes, but there's a whole different feeling in this country now. Like hundreds, even 1,000 people came to stop it. But he said he went into a cave, Rabbi Winston, where there's a Beis HaMidrash. These Jews, what's happening now is unbelievable. There was a cave of a Beis HaMidrash in this area, and there was also a hut of a Beis HaMidrash in this area. And he went in and he asked these boys, "Where are you from? Where are you from?" And they said they're from Bnei Brak. And he said, "Bnei Brak, what are you doing here? You're in Yehuda v'Shamron, what are you doing here?" He says there is a whole movement now happening, that they're starting to understand that we're in the redemption process. And part of the redemption process is Yehuda v'Shamron. That this is part of the redemption process. And they're coming here and they're learning, even in caves, because they understand what is happening here. It was actually unbelievable. And he also said something else, Moshe Feiglin, which was he explained everything that's happening now in terms of everything. But he said something so interesting. He said what Yiddim in Chutz La'aretz don't seem to understand, that no matter how frum you are, with the way that the world is working now, unless you come to Eretz Yisrael, you cannot any longer be sure of what will happen to your grandchildren or your children in terms of remaining Jewish. That's what he said. That we are in a time of history where things are flipping so quickly, that really living in Eretz Yisrael is that assurance.
Yeah.
So I want you to maybe address some of this, and then I can open it up. I see somebody else wants to ask a question.
In terms of the first point, it's important to know, I mean, it's really a shiur to itself. But just very briefly, that the Vilna Gaon, he says that I mean, we know, as I mentioned before, that there are 2 stages of Gula: Mashiach ben Yosef process and Mashiach ben David. These are the 2 aspects. Right? Mashiach ben Yosef starts things off, Mashiach ben David finishes it, basically. But the Vilna Gaon, he explains that there's actually represents 2 types of gulas. One is called the first word. I mean, it's gulas hadoros and gulas hashanim, gulas hadoros. Basically, the idea. He says one is based upon time, right? Mashiach ben Yosef is based upon time, and that's why you can make calculations for it. You can actually, because since it's time based, you can make calculations. But the final redemption, the actual time the Mashiach will come and do what we're expecting to do, belongs to what's called the gula of Doris, of the generations. And he says that's not a time-based calculation, and that's why no one knows it. And the Zohar says even God himself has not articulated it himself. It's in his heart, it says, but he hasn't verbalized it. So when Yaakov Avinu tried to give over the time of the final redemption, either he was only giving over the first one, or that's why he was stopped from giving over the second one, because he wasn't able to articulate the actual time itself. So no one can tell you 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 11 years. What's the difference? He says because the Doris, the Shanim, is basically just the first stage of Mashiach ben Yosef, and that's by, there's a kates. There's a time by which history must yield certain results. The Holocaust happened, according to Kabbalah, because Eretz Yisrael in 1948 had to come back to the Jewish people. Just like Mitzrayim, the slavery increased, and Moshe came back and he complained about it and said, how is this Geula, right? So Hashem said, this is Geula, because you're not ready and it has to happen. That's a shunning, right? So 1948, the Jewish people had to get back their land. Going back to Maaseh Bereshis. Going back to Maaseh Bereshis. So therefore, things had to be sped up because of a process called birur, separation of the sparks from the tumah and all that, right? So that's time-based. He says, but Begulus Adoirus is based upon where the nation's holding. So you notice when Hashem says in Bris Ben Abasari, in Tavram Avinu, he says, your children will be strangers in the land not their own for 400 years, but the fourth generation will come back. He doesn't tie, he says, you'll be, all together, but the fourth generation will come back. That's why Jews died in the desert. Even the Meraglim, you can learn out, had to happen. Because the Jews had to die in the desert. They came into Mitzrayim. They weren't ready for Gula. But the generation born in the desert, they were. So therefore, Hashem worked with them instead. It wasn't an accident. It was all part of the historical process because everything by definition has all been laid out since Maaseh Bereshis, including the time the Mashiach is going to arrive to. But because of that, he says, you can't know. It depends where the generation is holding. October 7th happened when it did 2 years ago to bring the generation up to spiritual speed. Don't like it, hate it, how can God allow it? Yeah, all these questions we have. We ask, but we're humans, we're living in the 20th century. We don't, or 21st century. We don't want to, accept that things like that can happen to the Jewish people. But they do, because that's how Jewish history works as part of the process of redemption. Because it's either galus or gula, one of the two. So that's based upon the generation. So whatever we're going through, all the suffering going through, it's all for the sake of making the Jewish people ready for final redemption. So when someone says 11, 12, I'm sorry, and I don't care, even if it's like a makubal, I'm not interested. Okay, but so how do I know that what's going on today? Well, that's a different story. I'm not predicting Mashiach's arrival. I never have, and I never will, because I don't even know how to. All I'm doing and all I've ever done is quoted the lesson, which is really quoting the Zohar, when Techiyas HaMesim has to begin, when resurrection of the dead has to begin. And those are fixed numbers based upon Kabbalistic things to do with the spheres and all that. Those are pretty fixed. And because of them, we kind of know by which time Mashiach has to come, because it's already after the Messianic era. And that's a lot closer, a lot closer. We're talking in our time, these years, right now. And that's why what's going today, it's not just Jewish history taking a downturn, another downturn. Everything supports the idea it's biblical, what's going on right now. And therefore, we have to prepare for it. And all these strange things that are happening, right? They're all part of that preparation process. But we can't even understand why or what and how. We just have to kind of wait it up. But without all those things, we have more than enough material, more than enough ideas, more than enough incidents going on. The direction of the world, you just pay attention to the news, which I try not to do, but it spills over. Everything that's happening today points in one direction. Kodesh Baruch Hu is bringing his redemption. Yosef says to Paro says, there's no one like you who can understand what God wants to do. And Yosef says, you're right, God's talking through me. So Paro says, so why repeat the dream twice? Why the same idea twice? That's why everybody else has different interpretations. You're saying it's all the same thing. Why twice? Yosef says, because God's telling you not just what he's planning to do, but that he's doing it quickly. He's purposely catching your attention, making time seem like it's speeding up, all these, whatever it is. But he's warning you, you don't have time to wait. So whenever things, David HaMelech said, Meis Hashem Haisazos, he nifas beinenu. If it catches your attention and there's wonderness in your eyes, he says, it's direct, overt hashkofah pratis. 60 years ago, 100 years ago, it could have also been a redemption, but there was still time left. We don't have that time anymore. What about the 210 years? No, we don't have that. Because Techiyas HaMesim takes place in that period of time. After Mashiach already come. We're at the end. Mamela, we ran out of time. Whether you want to believe it or not, we have run out of time. So now the rest, just becomes what do I do about it? How do I live with that? How do I, take it more serious? Like musical chairs, when the music is going, it's great. But the moment it stops, you got to grab a chair. Otherwise, you're out. And that's what the Kodesh Baruch Hu is doing. It's his music. As long as there's no Kates, there's no time that Gula has to come, history goes on like there's no God, as if it's all natural. But the moment that a Kates comes up, the music changes. It's God's tune now, and we dance to that music, and that's what's happening right now. We're being forced to dance to God's music, And you have to decide, what does that mean for me? How do I deal with it? But I'm telling you that pasuk from David HaMelech, ki ratzav dechas of neves, it's key. So I have one more question, then I've got to go. I'm sorry.
Okay, does anybody, Esty, did you want to ask a question? Let me just let me just see on the, one second, why can't I see the chat? 1 minute. Is anybody, someone asked Tu Ba'aretz, who authored it?
It was Rav Nosson Shapiro was the author. In 1656 was the Sefer was published. He was, as I mentioned, he was the Mordastro. He was the head rabbi of Krakow, Poland in his time. His father was before him, and then he moved to Eretz Israel, became the rabbi of Yerushalayim. And it's the actual material, as he says in the beginning, he says, none of this is mine. It's all the Arizal, he says. So the Arizal is really the author, but it's just that, and through the Rav Chaim Vital wrote it down in manuscript form, and that was buried in Damascus, and they found in 16 whatever, and they brought it to him. So it's the material is the Arizal, but written up by Rav Nosson Shapiro.
Wow.
Okay, if anybody has more questions, they can write to me, and I'll
Rabbi Winston, do you recommend the Sefer, or is that like over
it's in
our pay
Hebrew.
grade?
How's your Hebrew?
I'm not sure.
The truth is, if you go to a Sense website, Sense Chabad in the Svat, they have a very good website in terms of Kabbalistic material. If you go to their English site and you type in Tuva Aretz, my friend who was the one I know about the Sefer because my friend was the one who founded a microfiche and then republished it, and he then translated parts of it, a lot of it, into English, and they put it up on their site. So if you go to a Sense website and you type in Tuva Aretz, you will be able to access a lot of the English material.
Which website is it?
Sorry?
Which website is it?
Ascent. ASCENT.
Okay.
Rabbi
Same thing with
Winston, I
Asheris
just want to
Qureishis.
say that years ago you spoke in my house when I lived on Rodeo Drive in Toronto. You were amazing. You had just written your commentary on the Tehillim, and it was so brilliant. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember that? Obviously, you didn't have your gray beard, and I wasn't 72, but
yeah, and more hair probably.
It was just amazing, and I really enjoy hearing you whenever you speak.
Thank you,
Thank
Arabella.
you.
Thank you. Okay, Rabbi Winston, I hope you'll come back again. This was actually unbelievable.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was brilliant. It was unbelievable. Hashem should give you the koach to continue to wake up the world, to wake up the Jewish world.
I mean, first I wake up myself and work on the world.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Amazing. Thank you. Okay, everyone.